Thank you for joining us. This is Business Incorporated coming to you live from Lagos. I'm Chimeze Obi Iwago. On the show today, Angola's Sonangol plans to build refineries to end fuel imports. ThyssenKrupp Airspace Unit to build production site in Morocco. Plus, a look at Africa's economic growth prospects. Now let's get the show started with the markets. And here on the African continent, Egypt is closed for the weekend but was up 0.13% on Thursday. And the South African JSE index was trading low 1% at intraday. However, here in Nigeria, the index continued Thursday's positive sentiment, trading up 0.18% at intraday. Nairobi was down 0.54% on Thursday. The Middle East markets are closed today, but on Thursday, the markets were all in the green. The Saudi index edged up 0.08%. In Dubai, the index rose 0.53% as Emma Properties, which had been weak in the last several days, rebounded 0.8%. Abu Dhabi's index was up 0.22% and Qatar was up 0.03%. Qatar's commercial bank rose 1.6% after its chief executive said on Wednesday that it would deploy more capital to Turkey to benefit from closer political ties with that country. Well, let's quickly take a look at Wall Street. The U.S. stocks were on track to open sharply lower on Friday morning as investors took a more cautious approach as bond yields kept rising. Dow futures were pointing to a drop of more than 250 points at the open as jittery investors kept their eyes on the bond market and awaited a closely watched monthly jobs report due out at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Our economies are expecting 180,000 non-farm payrolls were added in January and that wages grew at a slightly higher annual pace of 2.6%. Now, the jobs number will be followed by consumer sentiment and factory order numbers at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. In earnings, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Honda, Motors, and Merck are set to report before the bell. And in Asia, shares came under pressure on Friday after Wall Street closed mixed and yields on U.S. government debt rose in the last session. Japan's Nikkei 225 resumed its slide, closing down 0.9% after snapping a 6-day losing streak in the previous session. Across the Korean Strait, the Kospi fell 1.68% to end at 2,525.39 as declines in blue-chip tech names drove the index lower. In Australia, the ASX 200 tacked on 0.51% to close at 6,121.4. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index edged up 0.17%. On the mainland, the Shanghai Composite advanced 0.46% to close at 3,462.94 after touching its lowest levels in 2 weeks on Thursday. Meanwhile, the Shenzhen Composite finished the session 0.03% higher. And back here, for most economic analysts, the outlook for the economy across Africa this year is looking cautiously positive. Now, the chief economist at Afrexim Bank, Dr. Hippolyte Fofack, has just produced a piece on the economic prospects for Africa in 2018 and is in our studio, Abuja studio, to share his thoughts with us. Good afternoon, Dr. Fofack. Thank you for joining us. That's a tongue-twisted name, I must say there. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Right. So tell us what your report on Africa's growth prospects for 2018 says.
I have to say that we've gone through some very difficult time in 2015 and 2016, especially with the downturn in the commodity market. And we've come through some very difficult periods, especially reflecting the fact that even though we've been on the path to economic diversifications, most African countries overwhelmingly highly oil-producing economies are still very much dependent on that particular commodities. And if you look at the continent as a whole, we have, in terms of estimate, that all exporting countries account for almost 50% of the region GDP. In that context, it's not easy to realize that when oil price goes south, we have the implication in terms of economic growth. But what one can say is that over the last few quarters, the last 3-4 quarters, we've seen a rebound in African economies, which are projected to strengthen in 2018, almost hitting 4% by the end of the fourth quarter in 2018. And this, in our view, reflect a number of factors. First, the most important one, the increasing resilience of African economies to global headwinds. And second, the fact that African economies are increasingly diversified, both in terms of source of growth, but also destinations of trade, and which has enabled the region to actually weather the adverse impact of what one would call the fiscal and sovereign debt crisis within the euro area. So we've seen African economies resisting global headwinds in a way they had not done in the past. Another important factor that is worth mentioning here is that we've seen an increasing growth in the rate of intra-African trade, which have risen from about 8% to almost 15% as we speak. And it's well known that as the intra-African trade component will grow and rise, that will actually lead the region to reduce its vulnerability to adverse commodity trade shocks. And what is actually driving the growth that we see within the regions? I think there are a number of factors, both internal and external factor. On the external factor, it's important to point to the fact that the Chinese economy, which has become the leading trading partner of Africa over the last few decades, has been able to sustain a strong and robust rate of economic growth. And to the surprise of the world, rebounding and even accelerating in 2017 to reach almost 6.9%. And as China grows, so does African countries, which very much depend on China for trade. Now, in terms of external factors still, and I have to say that even though we've seen an increasing interest rate in the US, the financial conditions are still on the accommodating side, which actually will drive investment and reduce the risk perceptions in the developing world as a whole. In terms of domestic factors, I think it's important to point out the fact that there is an increasing rise in intra-African trade, but also increasing cross-border investment within the regions, which are both driving intra-African trade, but also driving the process of sustainable growth and long-term growth, in the sense that cross-border investment, it's less sensitive to global volatility, especially it's really driven by what we call the patient capital.
Right, Dr. Fofack, aside from the prospects that you've talked about, what are the challenges that you see therein?
I think the prospects of almost 4% growth in 2018 are really subject to a number of downside risks.